The following presentation is from PBS Home Video.
The fall of Berlin in 1945 was not simply a military event. In war, the fall of a capital never is. If tonight's program seems to present it as a singularly Russian triumph, do not be surprised. To the Soviets, that indeed is what it was presented to be. This map shows the military situation in early 1945. On April 11th, advanced units of the United States Ninth Army made contact with the Russians on the River Elbe. It is important to understand why there was no race for Berlin. Militarily, it is almost certain that the Anglo-American forces could have reached Berlin first. But Eisenhower made it clear that his strategy excluded Churchill's idea of a quick thrust for Berlin. The Soviet army would be the first to raise its flag in Berlin. And perhaps there was a certain rightness to that, given the enormous sacrifices of the Soviet people.
The Thousand-Year Reich, Hitler's dark vision. A rapacious empire built on pomp and pageant, and on war. Now the vision is evaporating. Germany is on its knees. And retribution is at hand. As 1945 dawns, the sky is literally falling in on the people of Germany. Massive fleets of British and American heavy bombers pound cities, factories, and oil refineries to rubble. Sudden death has become a way of life in Germany. The Nazi edifice is crumbling. The Luftwaffe, once supreme, is all but powerless to interfere. Outnumbered 6-1, it is short of modern aircraft, pilots, ammunition. Above all, it desperately lacks fuel. Yet final defeat will not come from the skies, but over land. Germany is surrounded. From every frontier, enemies are marching on the heart of the fatherland. In the West, Allied armies cut deep into Germany during the first months of 1945. They have twice as many men as the Wehrmacht, 4 times as many tanks. and they are infinitely better supplied. But Hitler is sending his last reserves east in a desperate attempt to stave off an even more deadly foe. The Red Army, already sweeping through Eastern Europe. By mid-March, the Red Army has seized most of the Baltic coast. And it has smashed its way through Nazi-occupied Poland. Wehrmacht troops, loyal for so long, are surrendering in their thousands. As Soviet forces press hard against the German frontier. A sign marks the spot. This is accursed Germany. The scene is set for one last great Soviet drive west, to Berlin. As the Red Army storms towards the capital, it liberates Soviet citizens captured by the Nazis for slave labor. And it frees surviving victims of the concentration camps. The experience leaves Stalin's troops hungry for revenge. They've reconquered lands blighted by Hitler's wildest experiments in genocide. They've been to Auschwitz, where millions of mutilated corpses cry silently for vengeance. Hatred of the Reich needs little encouragement at the front. Hitler knows he is surrounded. As giant pincers close around him, he orders the defense of Berlin to the last German. Old men, women and children prepare for a desperate fight against hopeless odds. Yet at the same time, Hitler orders a scorched earth policy, the destruction of mines, power stations, water supplies, anything that might sustain life for survivors. It is his final betrayal of the German people, a people who remain astonishingly loyal in the face of certain defeat. In his madness, Hitler believes that they have failed his vision. This is his revenge for what he calls their treachery. Though even now they are willing to die for him. Boys of the Hitler Youth ready themselves for battle. Innocents devoured by evil. Ordinary people still cheer Hitler's armies, but what else can they do? These troops are all that stand between Germany and Armageddon. By late March, the Western Allies are across the Rhine, and beyond that great natural barrier, Germany lies almost undefended. As the German army's will to fight at last begins to slip away, soldiers and civilians flee west. Better by far to seek mercy from the British and Americans than at the hands of Stalin's avengers. Goebbels' propaganda has shown them what to expect from Stalin. They know that the Red Army is seeking vengeance for Hitler's atrocities in the East. But even in the West, British and Americans exact full retribution for SS crimes. Allied troops escort a prisoner who is informed against camp guards. His identity is concealed. Fear of the Nazis will not die overnight. Yet even now, the Führer is juggling improbable strategies for victory. He refuses to believe that his country lies in mortal peril. Insanely, He is convinced that massive counteroffensives in the east can still bring victory. But the armies to carry them out exist only in his imagination. And the Red Army is coming to shatter his illusions. Its great assault on Berlin is about to begin. Marshal Zhukov, never defeated in battle, will command Soviet forces. He is the Soviet Union's greatest military hero.
He was the only one who could talk to Stalin without constraints. If Stalin was not right, say about some military issue or whatever, he was the only one who could discuss it with him or argue with him.
At the beginning of April, Stalin and Zhukov meet in Moscow, preparing the final blow against Hitler.
I was there when they were walking in the Kremlin. Stalin used to keep a step behind, and he put his arm round Zhukov and he said to him, "You are my Suvorov, the great general who defeated Napoleon and never lost a battle."
But Stalin's paranoia and his mistrust of generals means that Zhukov can enter the Kremlin a marshal and leave moments later under arrest. And Zhukov is a prime candidate for such treatment. His uncompromising character and hints of independence have been known to prompt displeasure, even rage, in Stalin. The dictator knows that in this, the Soviet Union's vital hour of decision, he must have his most brilliant commander at his side. Nevertheless, as Zhukov prepares to take Berlin, NKVD agents are watching him.
Abakumov, Beria, Kobolov, and Merkulov started to collect evidence against Zhukov after Hakim Gol. They tried even harder after he became commander of Kiev military region and then head of general headquarters. They started filling the dossier against him at exactly that time. They followed everyone, and any little incident, however minor, was added to the file.
But Stalin's secret files are for later. Zhukov is safe for now, at least until Germany is beaten. The night of the 15th of April. 22,000 heavy guns announce the Red Army's offensive east of the German capital. Stalin claims he has 6 million men against less than 1 million armed remnants of every unit the Reich can muster. In the south, Konyev's first Ukrainian front breaks through at once to sweep round Berlin. In the north, Rokossovsky's second Belarusian front overcomes difficult terrain to take Mecklenburg. And in the center, Zhukov's great host grinds inexorably west towards a ruined Berlin still reeling under incessant air attack. On the 19th of April, Soviet troops reach the Berlin suburbs. Now it is street fighting, house by house, everyone a natural redoubt for desperate defenders. Casualties mount. Resistance stiffens, but the Soviet armies cannot be halted now. Hitler's Reich has been pierced to the heart. The apartments of high-ranking Nazi officials, now lying directly in the path of Stalin's vengeful armies, are shaken by the battle. Those who have prospered by Hitler's promises face the collapse of all they have believed in. Yet Hitler still lives. Prowling the bunker, he gloats over his photograph albums, celebrations of past glories. While his people pay the price of defeat, he celebrates the death of Roosevelt as a portent of victory. And imagines the imminent outbreak of war between the Allies. On the 25th of April, southern units of Konev's front make contact with United States forces at the Elbe. No hint of future tensions here. With these happy scenes, Hitler's last fantasy evaporates. Commanders with Konev's and Patton's armies hold a banquet to celebrate their momentous meeting. Steak and a special victory cake are on the menu, washed down with champagne and followed by toasts. Whiskey meets vodka. Now, as Soviet forces converge on the center of Berlin, the fighting embraces everything and everyone in the battle zone. But even now, Hitler has one guardian angel, fighter pilot Hannah Reich. The only woman to receive an Iron Cross in the Second World War, she is utterly devoted to the Führer. On the 29th of April, she pilots her light aircraft into the heart of Berlin. Touching down on the Unter den Linden, she makes the perilous journey through the mayhem of battle to Hitler's bunker, where he waits the end, comforted by a few treasured possessions. Pictures of himself, reminders of better days, and his family tree. Hannah Reich is Hitler's last chance to escape. But he will not leave. Preferring to cling to the past, he chooses to meet his destiny in Berlin. Next day, the last day of April, the Führer marries Eva Braun. She will share his chosen fate. But for the defenders in the streets, there is only one choice left to make, between surrender and death. Many are giving up the fight, but pockets of fanatical resistance remain. And in this final battle for Berlin, so close to the end, many on both sides will be struck down. and tens of thousands will die. General Ustugov commanded a Red Army battalion through the battle.
We launched the Oder Berlin offensive on April 16th and ruptured the enemy defense. I cannot remember eating or sleeping, but I remember every detail of the combat operations. Everybody does, because it was one of the final battles and because we paid dearly for it. In the 2nd Battalion, only 2 soldiers survived, and no one from the 3rd. All the reinforcements were youngsters who had grown up in occupation, kids who had been taken by force over here and had grown up in German territory. Field recruiting officers drafted them and sent them straight to us, untrained. And that's what I remember, them lined up, our last formation. The battalion had no more than 70 people, including the liberated prisoners of war. They were easy to spot as they didn't have full uniforms. They might have a cap and tunics with civilian trousers or the other way round. They couldn't fight in their prison clothes, and there were youngsters who were only 15 or 16 when they were sent. In 1944 we started drafting at 17. And they rarely had uniforms. They were trained there and then how to load automatic rifles, how to throw a grenade. Can you imagine what price we had to pay for those final battles?
And the struggle for the last citadel of German government, for the Reichstag itself, claims many more young lives. SS units defend the Reichstag to the last man. But on the 30th of April, Soviet troops charge up the steps and burst into the building. At last, the red flag flies over Berlin, and the death of Nazi Germany is just a breath away. Hitler is truly vanquished.
What did the raising of the flag at the Reichstag mean? It was a symbol of victory, the end of the war and the start of a new life.
Only the last act remains. Somewhere, cowering in the ruins of Germany, are Nazi leaders whose fanaticism has terrorized Europe and the world. But defeat is more than they can bear. The charred remains of Goebbels. His wife Magda is also dead. Before killing themselves, they order the family doctor to poison their 6 children. Himmler, a British prisoner, chooses suicide. For many other Nazis, and for their families, the end of the Reich means the end of everything. An epidemic of suicide sweeps Germany. For those Nazi leaders still alive, incarceration. Goering hands himself over to the Americans. Keitel, Dönitz, Speer, and of course Hess, all prisoners. But where is Adolf Hitler? Mikhail Poselsky receives news that Hitler's body has been found at the Chancellery.
We entered the hall on the ground floor. It was a large conference room, and in the center was a body covered by what looked like a grey soldier's blanket. A general ordered the soldiers to lift the blanket, and there was a middle-aged man who looked a lot like Hitler. He had a moustache, and the parting in his hair was on the right-hand side, which was not common, and a forelock covering his forehead. He also had a corporal's award in his buttonhole. At the bridge of his nose, just below his forehead, was an incoming bullet hole, so the nose had shifted and was swollen. You can see it on the photograph, and of course this distorted his features. The chief pathologist of the first Belarusian front was called in. He was a colonel. He asked for a profile shot of Hitler, which was easy to find in the Reich Chancellery. And he held it up to the dead man's face and started to compare the ears. I didn't know this, but he explained that ears were like fingerprints. No two people have an identical pair of ears, and so he couldn't conclusively determine if this was Hitler or not. His verdict: the body was not Hitler. After that, they completely removed the blanket, and we saw the whole body. We noticed that his socks were darned in several places. This helped prove that it was not him, as Hitler was unlikely to wear darned socks. Hitler had a butler who looked a lot like him, moustache, everything. Even Hitler said to him, "Shave off your moustache, or people might confuse us one day."
But Hitler's remains are found by Soviet troops in Berlin. He has poisoned Eva Braun and then shot himself, leaving orders for their bodies to be burnt in the bunker garden. Stalin is informed of the discovery by Zhukov, but refuses to believe it. He insists that Hanna Reich could have saved the Führer. And he sends Beria to Berlin to investigate events during the bunker's last hours. The Red Army is still fighting in Czechoslovakia. But for troops in Berlin, this is a time to honor 300,000 comrades lost in the battle. Yet it is also a time for celebration and for relaxation after the grim privations of their trek across Eastern Europe. They have a chance to rest now, but they are a long way from home. And for most, there will be no swift return. There will be armies of occupation in Berlin for many years to come. Germans still alive in Berlin face an existence without hope. The German tradition of law and order cracks. They face starvation and homelessness. Forced to loot and fight for survival, drunkenness is a release from crushing defeat, a defeat which brings the horror of rape to thousands of German women. Berlin stands at a crossroads. Its citizens, old and new, can only guess which way the future lies.
What am I? I'm just an ordinary country girl. I did my 10 years at school, and then when the war started, I went to the front. I made my way through the Ukraine, Crimea, and then up to Berlin.
Germany's fate lies in the hands of the world's new leaders. The Reich's representatives, now powerless, must bow to their conquerors and perform their final function: unconditional surrender. The ceremonial signing takes place in Berlin's eastern suburb. Zhukov leads the Allied representatives, followed by Tedder, Eisenhower's British deputy. Just after midnight on the 9th of May, German capitulation is formalized. Keitel signs for Germany. Grim-faced, resigned, he will later be hanged for his crimes. Victory in Europe, sealed at last. At a festive banquet, the generals salute their triumph, and Zhukov dances Ruskaya, though the cameras are sent outside. For the Red Army and for the Soviet people, festival time. Even in Stalin's prison communities, the gulags, they celebrate. These rare stills show prisoners, some of them former Red Army troops. Every year, without fail, they will be forced to perform these official memorials to the war with Germany. The great patriotic war is over, but Stalin's war with his own people continues. In Berlin, as Zhukov inspects his conquests, Stalin turns against the man who brought him victory. NKVD agents are unleashed to incriminate him.
Abakumov went to Germany on Berier's orders to arrest anyone who could discredit Zhukov in any way. And Zhukov found out. He hadn't even introduced himself to Zhukov, even though he was Governor General.
Zhukov summoned him and asked, "On what grounds do you come here without permission to arrest people? If you do not leave tonight, I shall arrest you and send you back under guard."
They now started a direct attack against Zhukov. Air Marshal Novikov and then Zhukov's personal aide, Semochkin, were arrested. They were beaten until they gave false evidence against him. Novikov had to claim that Zhukov had organized a plot against Stalin. And Semochkin had to say that he had been sent to Eisenhower to establish undercover contact.
Zhukov's treatment of Abakumov will not be forgiven. He will spend years in Odessa and the Urals with no real military authority. A long list of less celebrated generals suffer worse. This order from the Supreme Soviet dismisses Air Marshal Novikov, strips him of medals and rank, and sends him to prison. These secret documents record the arrest of some 40 Soviet generals. They will not be released until after Stalin's death. And the file of General Telyagin, hero of Berlin. Beria is informed of his looting allegations against NKVD units. Telyagin's reward, a 25-year prison term.
Some people used to take things for themselves. General Sidnev, chief of NKVD in Berlin, was one. He knew what to take. His soldiers found Germany's gold deposits buried in a vault 100 meters below the ground level. Not the whole deposit, obviously, but a large part of it. And masses of gold things. Furniture, dishes, jewelry, etc. And that's what he took. We only found out 50 years later. He reported at the time to his superior, Serov, the Colonel General of the NKVD, and they split it between themselves. They kept 4 bags of Reichmarks, which should have been handed over to the state. Zhukov had ordered that all valuables taken in conquered territories be handed over to be recorded as trophies of war. But General Sidnev didn't do that. He simply ordered that the booty be distributed among our people in the provinces.
And while NKVD troops plunder Germany's treasures, Berlin's ragged children are playing with guns and its people are starving. As occupied Germany's Allied control zones come into force, Soviet authorities struggle to feed hungry Berliners. The Soviet Union cannot spare the food, but Stalin's new regime must appear benevolent. Livestock are brought into the center of town. Potatoes are planted. In future years, it is the Berlin Wall, not potatoes, that will spring up here. But for now, Red Army soldiers share their meager rations with German children in what has become a city of lost children.
Familiennamen unbekannt, hat die Eltern auf der Flucht. Hans-Dieter, ebenfalls Egon Schröder, 5 Jahre alt, Joachim Ilz.
Bereft families can only watch these special newsreels and hope.
Klaus Dieter, 2 Jahre alt, man war 7 Jahre alt, kam aus Adlershof.
This family is lucky. They have found each other. And this little boy, his father. This boy, his mother. But many more are less fortunate and will be orphans forever. Children deported from Nazi-occupied territories are returned to their homelands, though many will have no home to go to. These are Soviet children traveling home from the Nazi camps in Eastern Europe. Not only Jews, but Slav children from all parts of the occupied East. Tattoos on their arms mark them for life, and they face a future of official mistrust. Though they are victims of Nazism, Stalin views them as tainted by fascism. And the same suspicion falls on returning Soviet citizens and prisoners of war. This document shows Stalin's instructions to the State Defense Committee, placing returnees in 100 holding camps. There they will face NKVD interrogators, possibly imprisonment. There is no escape from Stalin, even for exiles. He invokes prior agreements with the Allies to ensure that emigres in their hands are returned to his control. General Krasnov, ataman of the Don Cossacks, has been fighting Bolsheviks since 1918. His army of 70,000 Cossacks has fought for Germany. At the end of the war, they surrendered to the British, who promised them immunity from Stalin's revenge. But on Stalin's demand, British authorities break that promise.
Солдаты окружили их, насильно их посадили в машины, и машин что-то так штук 40-50, их там было много офицеров.
Soldiers surrounded them and forced them into lorries. There were about 40, 50 lorries. They took them to one side of the bridge, and our detachments were waiting for them on the other side.
У входа в мост
They got out of the lorries and crossed the bridge on foot. Then the wives and the soldiers arrived. The officers were taken there. They didn't have to walk. Two tried to throw themselves into the river, but they were stopped. The English major, who had handed them over, watched as they were shot by the NKVD.
как их на месте расстреливали наши НКВДисты, войска внутренних дел, перед посадкой в эшелоны. Одна женщина охватила...
One of the women clutched her two children, who were only about 3 or 4, and threw herself into the river from the bridge, which was about 80 to 100 meters high. That's how it was. Shouts, cries, noise. Then everyone got into the train and they were sent away.
Traitors, their wives, their children, none escape Stalin's bloodlust. General Vlasov's renegade army, German captives, Soviet prisoners of war, deported Soviet citizens, a torrent of people in one direction. But as the railways haul Stalin's victims to their fates, the dictator's own train bearing his name is speeding to Germany to meet Allied leaders at Potsdam. As usual, Beria prepares the ground for his master. A massive security operation protects Stalin on his journey west. 17,000 troops and NKVD guards line the route. And Beria personally supervises security at Potsdam. Molotov is there too. But theirs are supporting roles. Potsdam is Stalin's great stage. Stalin is at the peak of his power, greeting the Allies with cordial self-confidence. Negotiations begin with the demilitarization of Germany high on the agenda. They confirm Germany's occupied zones, crowding them with some 6 million new Germans, exiles from Czechoslovakia, Hungary and Poland, where the communist Lublin government is recognized by the Western Allies. De facto Soviet control over the rest of Eastern Europe is never seriously disputed by Churchill and Truman. One mystery remains, the precise fate of the Führer, and Stalin will not be drawn into discussing details. The conference closes and the leaders smile, but they are moving in opposite directions. As their differences unfold and an iron curtain descends across Europe, politics will impose its own grim order on these happy scenes. But in 1945, Allied soldiers swap stories and positions. Russian men and women date British and Americans. They go dancing together in Berlin's nightclubs and bars, or arrange swimming parties on the lakes outside the city. Friendly games between East and West are organized on the sports fields. And it appears to the world that Potsdam has laid the foundation for lasting peace. On the surface, Germany seems to be a nation free to choose between West and East. Between capitalism and communism. As Nazi symbols crumble, others emerge in their place. But this honeymoon between East and West will be over soon. In just a few years, Stalin's tanks will complete the division of Europe. How can the people of Eastern Europe know that tyranny yet again seeks their subjection? They cannot see thousands of miles east to Stalin's prison camp on the Kolyma River, one among hundreds of islands of death and distress in the Gulag archipelago. 20 million people went through these camps under the communist regime. 4 million were shot. At least as many more died from sickness or starvation. Photographs and bones are all that remain, sad mementos of lives wasted. But for now, the atrocities of Stalin's camps are concealed from the world. Yet those of Hitler's regime are laid bare for all to see. 10 million people suffered in German death camps. Perhaps 8 million died. Some 3 million were Soviet citizens. Mummified human heads and tattooed human flesh are the reminders forced on German civilians visiting concentration camps after the war. Those responsible for these appalling crimes are tried by an international tribunal at Nuremberg in 1946. The celebrated Russian cartoonist Boris Yefimov was at the trials.
So I made Goering into a boa, a python coiled in rings, and that was the way he used to sit. He had an evil look in his eyes. They did not take him away during the breaks, and it was such a pleasure, a sadistic pleasure, to stand the other side of the barrier and stare at him. He was sitting about the same distance away as you are now from me. At first he avoided us, and then he started to look at us. That was very frightening. I thought, go to hell. And I could read in that look, a year ago I would have got you. Now, decades later, you wonder why we didn't have a version of the Nuremberg trials. Was Stalin better than Hitler? Were Yezhov and Beria better than Himmler and Kaltenbrunner? Did they kill less people? Did they torture less?
Goering's suicide cheats the hangman, but 7 leading Nazis are executed. But only now, 50 years later, is it possible to accurately establish Hitler's fate. Relics and documents buried for decades in Soviet archives and seen here for the first time have recently come to light. They include Hitler's uniform, his Iron Cross, his Nazi membership badge, This is his military cap. This his first aid kit, and the personal effects of those closest to Hitler. Goering's signet ring, Goebbels' orthopedic boot. Magda Goebbels' cigarette case, a gift from Hitler. Goebbels' gun, an ampule of poison, and Magda's. These are her remains. Hitler's personal library, including signed work by the infamous Nazi loyalist Robert Ley. The bodies of Hitler and Eva Braun lie hidden in secret tombs at Magdeburg in eastern Germany until 1970, when the KGB, under orders from Brezhnev and Andropov, crushed the bones and scatter them over German marshlands. Only fragments still exist: Hitler's teeth, and part of his skull, the bullet hole clearly showing. With the fall of the swastika, this is all that remains of the Führer. But from Stalin, omnipotent in victory, the world still has much to fear. Hitler is dead. Germany utterly defeated. As Soviet veterans, officers and men take the long road home, memories of pre-war days are purged by the magnitude of victory. Slava, glory, glory to Stalin, the banner proclaims. Stalin's omnipotence is accepted, applauded, celebrated, merged with the victory of the people and army in a great parade. A gigantic display of military and political power. The cult of personality is born.
He was not just a cunning man. I think there isn't a single Shakespearean villain who even comes close to him in terms of guile and the organization of Machiavellian deeds.
His road to power has been a bloody one. He's murderously trampled opposition wherever it might arise. Inventing and exploiting a system of forced labor which engulfs millions.
In my opinion, he was the greatest Tsar in the history of Russia. If one can use the word Tsar, and Stalin considered himself a Tsar, it's only natural. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter what title he gave himself or what title other people put on him. The fact still remains that he was the greatest Tsar this country has ever known.
But today, nobody approaches him in the Soviet people's affections, except perhaps Georgy Zhukov, the military architect of victory who now leads the parade. Stalin does not appreciate rivals for his people's regard, but Zhukov is too popular to dismiss. Instead, his reputation will be allowed to wither, his talents buried in a distant posting. It will be some time before the term superpower is coined. But on June the 24th, 1945, these marching columns publicly present the Soviet Union's claim to military predominance. The climax of the parade resounds with symbolism. A battalion of heroes of the Soviet Union hurl the banners of the defeated enemy at Stalin's feet. These days and weeks following the victory over Germany have a character all their own. It is a time when far-reaching options can be discussed.
At one of the meetings after the war, some of our generals suggested that we just keep our tanks rolling to the English Channel. Marshal Budyonny, one of the most zealous proponents of this idea. But Stalin interrupted him rudely and said, and who would feed them? By them he meant the Western Europeans. Nevertheless, in the east, in the Magadan area, there was an airborne army stationed ready at any moment to attack Alaska. And if Comrade Stalin so desired, so they could have moved towards New York or Washington.
But first, Stalin turns east. In fulfillment of the Soviet Union's obligation to its allies, Stalin is to declare war on Japan. He would not be Joseph Stalin without a concealed agenda. He plans a landing on the island of Hokkaido, an annexation or political control of almost 1/3 of the national area of Japan. He is deterred by the flight of a lone aircraft, the Enola Gay, and the bomb it carries. The devastation at Hiroshima, and a few days later at Nagasaki, leaves the world aghast, and generals with the realization that a new military order has come into being. On the day the Nagasaki bomb is dropped, Stalin formally declares war on Japan. His forces strike into Manchuria and Korea, where the Japanese army north of the 38th parallel will surrender to the Soviet commander. But the landing on Hokkaido never takes place. Until he acquires his own bomb, Stalin must restrain any further imperial ambitions. And it is time to turn his attention to the state of the nation, the condition of the Soviet Union after 4 years of war. Belarusia, Ukraine, and western parts of Russia lie in ruins. 2,000 towns and thousands upon thousands of villages are devastated. Over 25 million people without real homes. For millions, life takes on the ring of prehistory. Hovels and dugouts provide shelter. Plows are hauled by women and old men. But amongst the abandoned impedimenta of the German armies, at home, Soviet citizens, and above all women, begin the long fight back. Perhaps again, as he did in 1941, Stalin misjudges the spirit of his people. They have concluded a great war avid for change, eager to work for the future, certain that Stalin will bring a new life to them. But Stalin understands only compulsion. To be late for work incurs a 1-year sentence to forced labor. And there is a frightening, arbitrary quality, too, in the punishments awarded. The fate of Ukrainian girls returning from German forced labor during the war is recalled by Professor Semiriaga.
And I know for a fact that millions of Ukrainian girls who wanted to go home were sent straight to the mines in the Donbass region as a punishment for being in Germany and working for the enemy. After 2 years, when the mines were operating normally and when the men had come back from the army after demobilization, only then were the girls finally released to go home. Can you believe that? Women sent to the mines?
But on thousands of work sites like these throughout the country, people come voluntarily to perform the harshest labor. Massive efforts are put into rebuilding what the Germans have destroyed. But as reconstruction gets underway, the credit will all go to the party and to Stalin. In Moscow, Stalin is the spider at the center of the web. His correspondence file carries reports from Melenkov and Beria about events in all parts of the vast country. No item is too trivial for his attention. Traffic violations by children of ministers, details of the illicit distillation of vodka. It is in this file that a document sets the term for the return of German prisoners of war at the 1st of January 1949, although it will be another 5 years before all surviving German prisoners are returned. The labor of the over 1 million German prisoners in Soviet hands is beyond and apart from the Gulag system. By comparison with Soviet prisoners within the Gulag, their life is modestly privileged. They wear their own uniforms, are commanded by their own officers, and are allowed to write letters home. Acutely conscious of how his own people can be tainted by foreign contact, perhaps Stalin feels that these Germans, when they finally return to Germany, will spread the word. Willing Germans are put through a period of communist indoctrination. Some, no doubt, are genuinely convinced. For others, it is more the attraction of better living conditions than of Marxist teachings. It is as politic now for them to proclaim their loyalty to Stalin as it had been a few years earlier to obey Adolf Hitler. But for those Germans judged guilty of war crimes, and for Soviet citizens condemned as traitors, there is no mercy. The last public execution in Russia took place in the 18th century. Now, the spectacle is revived in town squares in the Western Soviet Union. Sometimes, to the bereaved, it provides some satisfaction. To everybody present, it provides a warning. In the cities, even as the pre-war terror returns, there is an air of normality, despite the knowledge that NKVD informers are active in every public place. But the maintenance of this veneer of normality is necessary for many people to preserve their sense of human dignity. People like Olga Simakova, who show in prison that indomitable spirit which sustained so many during the war.
We were all young, and there was a group of us at our college. We were all studying at the teacher training college, and there was one guy in our class who always seemed to be hanging around with us. He didn't seem to have any other friends at all. We used to tell jokes and talk about all sorts of things. Well, it happened. We never even suspected that there could be anyone who could stoop so low as to inform on us. So they started watching us. We got to know some French pilots. They were in a squadron called Normandy, who were based here in Russia, in Oryol. And I fell in love with the captain. Well, we all had boyfriends at the time, French, Americans, British, good lads, all of them. I was 23 at the time. I was arrested at home. They came for me at night. One of them was in civilian clothing, and the other was a major. We only had 2 rooms, and they came into the room where I used to sleep. They didn't even give me a chance to get changed. So I got up from my bed, and they were still looking at me. So I asked them to turn away. "We aren't allowed to do that," they answered. "Well, I'm still a woman, aren't I?" "What do you mean you're not allowed? That you don't have the right?" I asked. "You don't have the right to stare at me while I'm changing." I didn't understand then that this was all part of the process. We were all registered and processed by men just to humiliate us, to take away our human dignity, you see. We were all processed by men. They shaved us all over, stripped us down naked. My most terrible recollections are of Krasnaya Presnya prison, where they kept us in the same cells as the most hardened criminals. They would keep up to 100 people in one cell without anything, not even plank beds. We slept on the floor, and very soon we were covered in lice. So I kicked up a row. I was screaming that I wanted to speak to the prison chief, that I would not resign myself to these conditions, and that they had no right to keep us, political prisoners, in the same cells as hardened criminals. And this guard said to me, "Get away from the door." And I said, "How dare you speak to me like that?" And I lost my temper and gave the door an almighty kick. Well, believe it or not, the door wasn't even locked. And you know how heavy those iron-plated prison doors are. Well, this one hit the guard right here. And he burst into the cell covered in blood. And then I became really frightened. He had a pair of those heavy hobnail boots on, and he started kicking me all over. I was in complete shock. There wasn't an inch of my body that hadn't been kicked. So they took me to a doctor, and the doctor examined me and asked who had done this to me. When I told him that it was a prison guard, he immediately told me not to tell a soul. And I replied, "You mean to tell me that after they have nearly beaten me to death, you want me to keep my mouth shut?" So they put us all into these cattle carriages. So effectively, we had been sent to be exterminated. It was more like a torture than a railway journey. When we arrived at Vorkuta, the cold and frost was terrible, and we were in light summer boots and coats. Then I was shifted from one camp to another for almost 10 years. Some places were better than others. We did everything with our bare hands, loading, unloading, constructing roads. The mosquitoes and black fly would eat us alive, and the guards would taunt and do whatever they liked with us. Many people died. There was terrible malnutrition. They would just fall down and die where they lay. The conditions were appalling. We were not treated like human beings there. To them, we were just cattle.
Мы были не людьми. Это был самый настоящий скот.
But the screams from the Gulag are not always drowned by applause for Joseph Stalin. The Baltic states, devastated by war, are forcibly joined by Stalin to his empire. Commissars arrive to introduce Soviet reality. Land is expropriated and goods commandeered. Weapons acquired from both German and Soviets are turned by partisan groups against the new occupying army. But these are small peoples, no match for the Soviet forces ranged against them. In this region, where the terrain is not favorable to partisan warfare, the nationalists are unable to resist the NKVD troops for long. And so the peoples of the Baltic states join so many others in Stalin's dance of death. One of the numerous reports of those days, it records the exile to timber enterprises in Siberia of 300 Lithuanian families accused of anti-Soviet underground activities. Many thousands more will follow them into forced labor in the Far East as the revolts are suppressed. There is also unrest in the western Ukraine. A Ukrainian NKVD report about the operations against nationalist forces. In 1 month alone, over 2,000 people are killed and over 3,000 arrested. For many long years to come, these camps will become filled with Ukrainian nationalists who carry on the struggle in the forests of the western Ukraine with the forces of the communist regime. This bitter, protracted struggle by the Ukrainian nationalist insurgency army against Stalin's regime is brutally suppressed. Only Stalin will decide what national characteristics will remain. Only folk dances, or songs. But the only songs that were allowed were propaganda songs, which painted the people's lives in the most positive light. Like the words of this song, urging the people, good health and live prosperously in this prosperous land. But the people themselves knew in what conditions they were living. In these first post-war summers, Soviet reconstruction has the weather to fight too. In the Ukraine and other fertile grain-growing areas of southern Russia, the year 1946 brings first drought, then crop failure. There are no reserves. In the high summer of that year, famine once again visits the whole country. Throughout the country, millions of children are at risk. Many thousands of babies die before their first birthday. It is a further cross for the already overburdened peasantry to bear. Nikolai Minushkin was a peasant farmer during those days.
Life wasn't at all easy. They made us work a lot, and there was very little food. Well, you've got to eat, so we had to get it where we could, and eat whatever we could find. Conditions were such that you had to steal from the collective farm or somewhere else to survive. If you got away with it, you were lucky. But if you were caught, then it's straight to the prison with you.
They worked on the land they loved as their ancestors had worked before them. They had the right to work, but no other rights. Above all, no rights to the fruits of their labors.
One day, one of the women went to pick mushrooms with her young son. Well, on the way to the forest, she started just casually picking 1 or 2 ears of wheat or rye in the field. Well, she was spotted by the guard and was immediately sentenced to 5 or 6 years in prison. How many ears could she have picked? It couldn't have been more than 1 or 2. It's not as if she could have picked a bushel of it. Can you believe it? You'd have been arrested even for 1 ear of grain if they saw you.
At the top was Stalin. Below him, a hierarchy of mini-Stalins, the local bosses who supervise the peasants. Their function? To deliver the peasants' crop to the state. Targets are increased every year, and any boss failing to reach the new targets will be considered an enemy of the people and mysteriously disappear.
Well, the authorities are the authorities. They had all the privileges. They were provided for. They were entitled to 16 kilos of flour. They used to get everything brought and given to them. The chairman of the village Soviet, the party secretary, the teacher, we used to call them the hogs. The hogs were given everything. Flour, sugar, kerosene. And us ordinary collective farmers, what did we get? Well, a lot of man-hours in the field for a start. But that was about all we got. Apart from that, absolutely nothing else. We'd been working the whole year, and then they would come and take everything. Oats, wheat, rye, everything went. The granaries were left completely empty.
To feed the illusion of peace, prosperity and plenty, the workers are filmed taking their produce to Moscow for a festival. This is not gesture made of their own free will. They did not have internal passports, and without papers, it is impossible to leave their villages. They are chained to the land.
We were very frightened all the time. You might be sitting with me with a glass or two, and you might let slip something about the farm leadership or the government, or about Stalin. And by the time you got back home, they'd already be waiting for you. Well, you would get back home, and sure enough, there they'd be, saying, "Right, come along, you." Then off we'd go, right away to the carriage, to the cattle truck, and to lock and key, with one guard in one corner and the other one in the other corner, and off you'd go. Where to? Well, you'd know soon enough when you got there. Well, I don't think anyone would want the life I've had. My youth is over, and I can't say I've seen anything good in this world. I've been a slave all my life, you know.
Stalin, the provider of spectacle. Stalin, the showman of genius. The illusionist of conviction. And the everyday intensity of the illusion is now changing the way people think, creating two types of reality, that depicted by the state and a different, everyday reality, what people see and know around them. Truth and falsehood become inextricably mixed. Nothing is more characteristic of this savage world of make-believe than historian Galina Ivanova's strange story of certain border operations carried out by the NKVD.
I must point out that these places are completely documented. Also, there are a lot of eyewitnesses to the existence of these fictitious border posts all along the Soviet border. The lengths that the NKVD went to were completely unprecedented. They were inundated with false cases and were getting increasingly criticized by the judiciary for the flimsiness of their evidence. So a whole fictitious border complex would be created with a bogus Soviet border outpost on one side and on the other a bogus Manchurian border picket complete with bogus Chinese border guards played by Soviet convicts of Chinese origin. And all this was built on our Soviet territory. Then they would take a Soviet citizen under interrogation in prison and give him a choice. Either you spy for us, or we'll send you to the Gulag. Naturally, when faced with this choice, the majority of these poor fellows chose the former. Well, as soon as these unwilling spies crossed this fictitious border, these bogus Chinese border guards would be waiting for them. Then the beatings and torture would begin. They would try to beat information about the Soviet Union out of them. So eventually this poor person would agree to work as a double agent, signing the necessary incriminating documents to that effect. And on their return, they would immediately go and report what had happened to the NKVD, saying, "I was captured by the Chinese intelligence service and confessed everything to them. You can do whatever you like with me." The best that they could hope for was 25 years in the camps. But for most, it was the firing squad.
Voting procedures are diligently carried out, but they can mean nothing because the results are preordained. An absurd ritual has become a political system. And it is not only the Soviet people on whom Stalin inflicts his own image of reality. To be among his closest associates is to live the life of a schizophrenic. Foreign Minister Molotov, his wife under arrest. One of Stalin's most long-serving cronies, Marshal Voroshilov, will be accused by Stalin of spying for the British. Kaganovich, his brother, arrested and shot. In Stalin's own family, the devastation is almost literally beyond belief. Anna Alliluyeva, Stalin's wife's sister, mistakenly wrote a book of memoirs and received a 10-year prison sentence. Redens, her husband, is shot. The wife of Stalin's son, Yakov, is arrested. Kapler, his daughter's first love, is sent to forced labor. Neither family ties nor the flattery of the great diverts him from plundering the liberty of his countrymen, sacrificing their lives. Desperate to keep Stalin's displeasure at bay, the scientific and artistic establishment sign an adulatory address to the leader. Shostakovich signs, and all composers and leading members of the artistic world. But though Stalin needs adulation, it will not protect the intelligentsia in these early post-war days from a denunciation, a hint, a word in Stalin's ear. It is a wish hunt conducted by Zhdanov and Beria. It aims to reinforce that supervision of press and radio which is a characteristic of the regime, that excising of any wider Western influence from Soviet life. When the great poet Akhmatova is condemned, it is for her sensitivity to Western influence. She is arraigned as part nun, part harlot. With Zoshenko, she is one of the star victims of Zhdanov's purge. Figures from the world of entertainment are taken, some to the most notorious prison in Moscow, Butyrskaya, normally reserved for the most dangerous criminals. The popular singer Lydia Ruslanova, whose songs were played from dawn to dusk across the Soviet Union, is sentenced to 10 years imprisonment. It is like arresting a Vera Lynn, a Piaf, and Ella Fitzgerald. And Zoya Fyodorova, once the dictator's favorite actress, winner of the coveted Stalin Award. But in 1947, she falls out of favor and receives a 25-year prison sentence for falling in love with an American. When the film director Eisenstein shows the second part of his film Ivan the Terrible, Stalin recognizes himself in the portrait of a bloody and callous tyrant. He makes his reaction plain. Only a fatal heart attack saves Eisenstein from Stalin's wrath. In this world, the prison is more than a threat, a symbol. For thousands in the Zhdanov years and after, it is the first step on the road to Stalin's reality. In the world outside the Soviet Union, Winston Churchill makes a speech at Fulton, USA. Here he first uses the term Iron Curtain. An Iron Curtain, he proclaims, has descended between Stettin on the Baltic and Trieste on the Adriatic. If not the birth, it is the public christening of the Cold War. Stalin responds. He makes one of his utterly unexpected telephone calls. They are, to some men, the most frightening moments in their life. The cartoonist Yefimov was working on a cartoon of Eisenhower.
All of a sudden, I got this phone call, and this voice announced, "Comrade Stalin will now speak with you." Well, I was immediately out of my chair, almost standing to attention. He would never greet or say goodbye to anyone. He'd always get straight down to business. So I heard this slight cough, and then, "You over there. Now you're drawing a cartoon of someone. Do you know who I'm talking about?" "Yes, Comrade Stalin." "Well, this person has to be shown armed to his teeth. Tanks, planes, guns, the lot. Do you understand?" "Yes, I understand, Comrade Stalin." Well, in short, I managed to get it done with just minutes to spare. And even managed to write a note to the effect that as far as the cartoon itself is concerned, everything is ready. But the caption is really the responsibility of Comrade Stalin. At first, he wrote the caption in red pencil. "Eisenhower is on the defensive." Then probably his pencil broke, because there's only half a word here. Then he wrote in black pencil, "Alaska, Canada, the North Pole." And then wrote, "This is the place where the threat to American liberty is coming from." It was all written in his handwriting. It was, I believe, a rather quaint way of declaring the Cold War. Quite frankly, I was within a hair's breadth of death, because if I hadn't fulfilled my task to Comrade Stalin's liking, then he, as was his wont, would have wasted little time in having me investigated. And I'm sure our NKVD friends in the Lubyanka would have had little difficulty in proving that I had been deliberately not doing my job properly on the orders of the CIA, or something like that.
But for Stalin, there can be no Cold War on equal terms until atomic parity is achieved. The result, on the 25th of September 1949, is a portentous announcement from Moscow. The news agency TASS announces the successful testing of the first Soviet atomic bomb. It is achieved by Russian scientists already far advanced towards producing the A-bomb, supported by Soviet intelligence agents in the United States and Britain. The Soviet bomb is a powerful, if not yet a highly sophisticated weapon, but other tests follow, and the West knows that the Soviet Union has definitely entered the nuclear age. It is a present for Joseph Stalin's 70th birthday. A birthday celebrated on a gigantic scale. A new figure is present at Stalin's side during the celebrations in December 1949. Only 2 months earlier, Mao Zedong has led his communist army to victory. He is now the unchallenged leader of the new People's Republic of China. It is potentially a vast access of power to the communist world. But as Stalin watches the massive birthday displays arranged in his honor, he has no way of knowing how independent a force China will be. During the celebrations, Mao and Kim Il-sung of North Korea pressed Stalin to endorse a North Korean attack on the south. With expansion westward blocked by the formation of NATO, Stalin cautiously agrees. Within 6 months, American pilots are in aerial combat with Russian planes over Korea. To Stalin's surprise, the US has reacted rapidly and under the banner of the United Nations.
In one of his cables to Mao Zedong, Stalin stated, "A prolonged war would be profitable for us. I think we should let it last for another 2 or 3 years. It is true that the Koreans will suffer a lot as a result, but they are doing it for the world proletariat revolution, because the longer we can drag out the war, the more exhausted the Americans will become." But he was quickly forced into negotiations when there was talk of using nuclear weapons. We had only a few nuclear bombs, and they were nothing like as powerful as those available to the Americans, and so ended this infamous war.
At the 19th Party Congress, he delivers a derisive lecture on the nature of Western liberties. It is impossible to know whether he recognizes in it an accurate description of the state he himself has built.
Their so-called personal freedom is non-existent. Human rights are granted only to those with capital. Everyone else in their society is just considered as raw human material. All rights are reserved for the exploiting minority, and civil rights are denied to the exploited majority. The banner of bourgeois democratic liberties has been thrown out of the window. It is for us, the true representatives of humane democratic parties, to pick this banner up and carry it on further. If you want the majority of the people to be gathered around you, there is no one else who we can turn to pick it up.
Stalin's true state of mind in these days will perhaps now never be known. Yellow-eyed and watchful, Stalin can turn his terrible suspicions against anyone, however senior, however impressive their loyalty in the past. At a party plenary session, Professor Volker Gernhoff recounts,
Stalin pounced on Voroshilov, Mikoyan and Molotov, accusing them of being British spies. It was, of course, beyond any normal kind of reasoning, and everyone sort of shrank back. There was a dead silence.
In these last months of his life, Stalin now turns on the medical profession, and especially the Kremlin specialists, many of whom are Jewish. In what will become known as the doctor's plot, he arrests Vinogradov, an eminent specialist. He is one of the first of many doctors, mostly Jewish, to hear the creak on the stair, the midnight knock, to be arrested and tortured, to confess a plot to poison members of the government. The patent absurdity of the accusations shocks everyone in the Kremlin milieu.
Stalin became extremely mistrustful, capricious and unpredictable. Everyone felt, and I think their presentiment was correct, that the case of the doctors was to be the signal of a new gigantic wave of purges in the country, and that if he did not die, then we would have even worse purges than we had had in the 30s.
Stalin's dacha. In Moscow government circles, all eyes are turned towards the unpredictable leader. Now in the Soviet state, nobody is safe, however eminent. A siege mentality reigns. Throughout the country, the fear is of spies and of denunciation for spying. Alexei Rabin was one of Stalin's bodyguards. He has collected the reports surrounding Stalin's death.
Well, at first, everything seemed to be going smoothly enough. But it was already 1 o'clock, and Stalin hadn't called for anybody yet. At 2, there was no call. Then again at 3, nothing.
What could all this mean? Stalin's sleeping routine had been completely ruined. That was the problem. Well, at approximately 6:30 p.m., a light came on in the big hall, so everybody relaxed a little. Now he's bound to call somebody. But there was still no call. Then the mail from the Central Committee arrived, and the chief guard took that as a pretext to look for Stalin and find out where he was. And when he went in, there was a terrible sight. Stalin was lying on the carpet.
The guards lifted him onto the sofa and placed a rug over him.
Chief Guard Starostin immediately phoned Malyenkov, because he was the second in command next to Stalin. He mumbled something incomprehensible in the receiver and hung up. The other guard, Logachev, remained there, keeping watch over the ailing Stalin. Then Malyenkov called for a second time. Can you imagine the nerve of the man? Go and find Beria, yourself. I can't find him. If he couldn't find Beria, his own friend, then how were we simple guards to know where that devil of a man might be, and with what kind of woman he might be sleeping with? At last, some 40 minutes later, Beria finally phoned saying, "Don't tell anybody about Comrade Stalin's death," and then just hung up the phone. The comrades in arms finally arrived at 3 a.m. Beria came in wearing a pince-nez, throwing back his head and making a racket. He was pretty boorish in general. So he noisily came into the hall where Stalin was lying. Malyenkov had a new pair of boots, which were squeaking, so he took them off in the anteroom, in the corridor, put them under his arm, and came in his socks. Well, the comrades in arms stood around for a while, and then Stalin began to wheeze. So Beria said, "Logachev, what did you raise such a scare for? Can't you see that Comrade Stalin is just asleep? Stop worrying us and don't disturb him further."
But Joseph Stalin was not simply sleeping.
Finally the doctors came. Their hands were shaking so much they couldn't even cut his shirt off him. Well, just imagine their state of mind. Not only were they confronted with the sight of Stalin dying before their very eyes, but also they had that butcher Beria looking over their shoulder the whole time saying, "Can you guarantee Comrade Stalin's life? Go ahead with emergency surgery, but I warn you, if he dies, the doctor responsible will be shot."
He dies during the night. A shocked nation hears the awesome news the following day. The sorrow of millions is sincere. The deep sense of shock is evident. It is as if the protection of an autocratic father has been withdrawn. He is buried with the greatest imaginable pomp. Many millions have suffered and know that ultimately he must have been responsible. But Joseph Stalin's death dissolved a partnership which no other leader in the Soviet Union would ever enjoy again. It was a partnership forged in the people's suffering in the Great War they had so courageously fought and won under his leadership, the war that cost over 20 million Soviet lives. Now, only as the years peel back the layers of deception, do we learn the full extent of that other war Joseph Stalin conducted, the parallel war against his own people. If his life remains a grim warning for the future, his death embodied the hope of a better world for millions. The miracle is that the people of the Soviet Union, by their unequaled resilience, survived not only the most savage war in history, launched against them by a foreign tyrant, but also the human losses of a quarter of a century of devastation, called down upon them by their own leader.
In 1952, a year before his death, Stalin had made a diplomatic overture to the United States to settle the Cold War. The arch-realist had concluded that an arms race against America was unsustainable, and he wanted either to settle or to split the alliance. We will never know which, for he died before his proposal could be explored. The Nazi state died in the bunker with Hitler. But the system that Stalin led survived for more than 3 decades after his death. In a very real sense, it was only when the Soviet Union collapsed, its guiding communist philosophy discredited, that Russia's war against itself was finally brought to a close.